host of this series, the first of which, and we're calling this Exploring the Cypriot Identity. I will let our co-host Anthony Anaxagorou take it away and tell you a little bit more about what brings us here today. And feel free to drop in the chat where you're joining us from today, what brings you here today.
Hi everyone, how's it all going? Good to see you. It's good to see so many people take up this opportunity to discuss Cyprus and all its complexities. I guess the kind of genesis of this idea, this series came about when Arianna reached out to me about 2 weeks ago and basically said, would you be interested in kind of working together on something? And we were originally going to do like a kind of Instagram live where we just discussed art, literature, Cyprus. But I kind of figured to have something that I feel has been missing from the discourse, which has been to talk about Cyprus in a public space with Cypriots from both the island and the diaspora, and to kind of have sometimes quite frank and maybe uncomfortable conversations about who we are and how we come to think of ourselves as Cypriots. So that's really been the kind of modus operandi, in that we want to establish a recorded document over the series of the next year or so, where we're going to be addressing, the five of us, hopefully monthly, depending on how we go, addressing some of the issues regarding the Cypriot identity. Because I think, as you can probably tell from the uptake here, it's something that everyone is very preoccupied with, and there is no real clear answer with who we are as Cypriots. And that's really what we're going to be delving into and unpacking over the course of the next 12 months.
And before I introduce everyone, I just want to give a little context for the group that I'm affiliated with, the Peaceful Poetry of Cyprus. We started in mid-December. Right now, it is a group that mostly only exists on the Instagram social media platform. And so far, we've published 17 poems by Cypriots. We published them in all three languages, the official languages of Cyprus, English, Greek, and Turkish. And we have started publishing poems in the Cypriot dialects as well. So I encourage all of you to contribute as you feel so moved. And I will drop my email in the chat as well if you want to reach out that way. And just some ground rules for how this will be going. We will be speaking with our panelists for about 50 minutes, and then we will open up for question and answer from the audience for about 20 or 25 minutes. And all of those questions will be submitted through the chat. So please feel free to drop those questions in. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we will try to get to the essence of each of the topics that arise. And also, unfortunately, I do have to mention this. We hope this will not be a problem, but as we mentioned on the Eventbrite, we do have a zero tolerance policy on hate speech. So anyone who does convey hate speech in the chat or otherwise, you will have to be removed if you are not respectful to the dialogue happening today. So with that, I will introduce each of our wonderful panelists. We have Anthony Anaxagorou, who is a poet, fiction writer, essayist, publisher, and poetry educator, and author of the poetry collection After the Formalities. You can get your copy, looks like this. Dr. Badia Kamal is a lecturer in contemporary and post-colonial literatures at the University of Kent and author of Writing Cyprus, Post-Colonial and Partitioned Literatures of Place and Space, which I have coming to me in the mail currently. But she was also a co-editor of Nicosia Beyond Barriers, Voices from a Divided City, which is full of some really phenomenal poems and a great introduction from her as well. Dr. Daniele Nunziata is a lecturer of St. Anne's College at the University of Oxford and author of Colonial and Post-Colonial Cyprus, Transportal Literatures of Empire, Nationalism, and Sectarianism. This is what that one looks like. And Ilaida Leto Agrotu Georgiou is writing her undergraduate dissertation on post-colonial literature at Cambridge University. Much of her research centers around the work of the panelists that join us today. So now to kick off our discussion, I'm going to ask each panelist what brings you here today. I'll start with myself. What brings me here today is, like Anthony mentioned, the discussion that we had around this question of Cypriot identity and how to bring it to a broader audience. And we'll be doing a poetry reading at the end of this. I realize I didn't mention that. So I hope it comes across with the poetry I share, but I really hope that all of you will see this as an open call to raise your own voices, contribute to the conversation, and share with us what being Cypriot means to you. So with that, I will hand it off to Anthony. Anthony, what brings you here today?
I think for me, I'm very excited and fascinated with how we navigate and dissect this very thing that we claim to be. I use the term British Cypriot. I kind of claim the dual nationality in the sense that I was born in the UK, but I'm of Cypriot heritage. And so I'm interested in the way in which we use these signifiers to construct systems of identity and personhood. And oh yeah, I'm supposed to bounce it off at someone. That's right. And that question, sorry, my notes are all the way up here. Who's that question go to next? And then.
Oh yeah, you can just hand it off to anyone.
All right. All right. Daniele.
Yeah, hi there, everyone. Kalispera, iyi akşamlar. As Arianna very kindly said, I study contemporary Cypriot literature, and I'm interested in looking at the kind of the influence, the legacies of imperialism on the ways in which culture is produced today, in particular with reference to Cyprus, but also thinking about other parts of the world by comparison as well. I've come to the study of this because some of my mum's family comes from Cyprus. My dad's family is Italian, hence why I have an Italian name, if anyone's kind of wondering as to that kind of discrepancy. And so like with Anthony, I suppose growing up, I've always wondered what it means to be part of a diasporic community and indeed two diasporic communities in the UK. And I've asked loads of questions about identity politics, about what it means to come from a certain place, what it means to have a sense of belonging and of home and homelessness. And I've tied all of those questions into my academic work. And I think that academia is enhanced, is elevated when we can bring the personal into our interrogation of the scholarly. And for that reason, I'm delighted to be here. And I thank my co-speakers for allowing me to join. Oh, and my turn to bounce off. I pass on to Baria.
Hi everyone, it's an absolute delight to be here. I guess to begin with, I'm Cypriot. I identify as Cypriot. I am a Cypriot. I'm a child of the diaspora. I've spent a lifetime feeling excluded. Born to Cypriot Turkish parents from Pile, Koudounas, that they came here in the 1960s, and I've spent, and then they always longed to return to Cyprus. So I've spent a lifetime kind of being in this in-between space between Cyprus and the UK. So that's the kind of personal connection. And then I lived in Cyprus for some time, tried to become a political peace activist, but was heartbroken by the failures in 2004 as a result of the referendum. And then of course, the failures by CCP, JTP. And then I ended up deciding to do a PhD. So I did my studies and my research on post-colonial Cypriot literatures in order to find an alternative narrative to write Cyprus that can move beyond the dominant binary legacies that I was being subjected to. And it resulted in this book, so the Writing Cyprus book.
I don't know. Go to bed.
Turkish literatures.
I know I'm on Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I just want to pause and say, if everyone could make sure they're muted. I thought we'd automatically muted everyone, but some of you are still audible. So just check and make sure you're muted. Thank you.
And I think I've ended up, as a result, being able to kind of negotiate with
It unfortunately seems that Badia may be paused for right now. So I think we will move on to an introduction from Elida, and then we can pass it back to Badia when she's able to join us again.
Hi, everyone. I'm doing my undergraduate dissertation on the panelists here. And like everyone's mentioned, what drove me to undertake this dissertation and future research on Cyprus is having lived in Cyprus and still feeling these emotions of displacement and disconnection, both with my fellow compatriots of the other side and also with even my own compatriots on my own side. And this desire to find a unified Cypriot identity that can really hold the weight and nuance of our experiences. So I'm really excited to see you all today and really excited for the conversation.
Thank you, Elida. And this first question I was going to pass to Badia first, but since, and it looks like she is back on now. Badia, can you hear me?
Yes, I am. I'm so sorry. I have no idea what happened.
No worries. But feel free to wrap up your remarks if you had more that you wanted to say, and then I'm going to kick off the first question with you. You're good? You're sure? Okay. Well, feel free to incorporate anything else you'd like to with this question. So today we're joined by a wonderfully large audience. We have 170 of you right now, representing various languages and religions, countries of birth and residence. I myself am a Cypriot American. I don't know if I mentioned that. Parents of Greek Cypriot descent on both sides. When we talk about the Cypriot identity, in what ways is it important to distinguish or not distinguish between these identities? And we'll start it off with Badia, and then feel free to pass it to whomever you'd like on the panel.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely on point that we distinguish, and we should distinguish through, I think, a distinct approach. I think that we have a responsibility to acknowledge the definition of this name. So what does it mean to be, when you say Cypriot identity? And it's a loaded term, it's a political term, and it has a historical process. First, I would say to think about the notion of identity through the way in which the greatest scholars of the 20th and 21st century, so Jacques Derrida, Gilroy Hall, and many, many more. So thinking about their approach that there's no such thing as identity, there is only identification. So identity is the name we give to the different ways we position ourselves. Identity is a mechanism that is always in the process of production. And this links to naming the people of Cyprus. So the people of Cyprus have been named in various ways. So during the Ottoman times, of course, there was a categorization religiously. Then with the British moment, so it was a Muslim and non-Muslim, the taxpayer and the non-taxpayer. Then, of course, with the British moment, there was this ethnicization, Greek and Turkish, but the British also did try and Cypriotize the Cypriots through their policies in the 20s and the 30s in particular, and moving on to the 50s, which was very much a means to say they are neither Turk nor Greek. They are these hybrid beings. And then, of course, this was very much rejected by the people of Cyprus. And it was not until partition in 1974 where Cypriots identified and appropriated this term Cypriot, predominantly through thinking of it as Cypriot Armenian, Cypriot Greek, Cypriot Maronite, Cypriot Turkish, and subsequently Cypriot became a term partially to generate this collective grouping. And I think we need to acknowledge this distinction, which links to every partition case in terms of there being a number game when it comes to names, a number game where we identify with multiple different names, but making sure we respect all of these names, even the ones that we may completely disagree with. For example, the nationalist, the radical right, the radical left, and so forth, in order to see the positions that there is common grounds. And I believe that all of this common ground is linked to the notion of place, space, and displacement. And it's particularly captured in the literatures of Cyprus that's depicted in my book, where there's a multiplicity of multiple engagement, identification with different positions determined by place and space. And there's an acknowledgement of the plurality through the literatures, but I also would veer away from using terms like unity as singular and thinking of it more as a fragmented, disjointed unity, where there's a multiple mutable identification with different positions that produces a multiple mutable Cyprus that can capture what I call a distinct Cypriot solidarity that I'd be very happy to talk about further, for what I call a differential Cyprus that we can all inhabit. So in short, yes, through approaching identity in this way, we move away from that really disturbing notion of what being a Cypriot may mean in terms of that imaginary hyphenated idea of the fixed Greek and fixed Turkish Cypriot identity, which is actually an imagined fallacy. And instead, I would say that we are post-Linobambaki, a mutable diasporic hybrid shifting between multiple geographies, cultures, as related to spatiality. Thank you. And I'll now hand you over to Dan.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Baria. And yeah, I agree entirely with what Baria's saying. I think that's a wonderful way to start this conversation off. I agree entirely with the suggestion that identities have a kind of arbitrariness to them, and certainly that they are constructed. I subscribe to the kind of a constructivist approach to the formation of identities as these arbitrary terms used in order to gauge a sense of one's position within the world and one's relationship with territorial borders. And as Baria was indicating, these identities change over time, in particular if we're thinking about the way in which identities on the island were forced to really come into fruition during the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and in particular in the 60s and 70s in response to colonialism, British colonialism, the drive within anti-colonial movements in order to create identities with which to gauge a sense of self, a stable sense of self, and with which to challenge British imperial rule. Obviously, as we saw in the 60s and 70s, that desire, that desperate and urgent desire for stable identities at times overspilled into extremist behavior, extremist attitudes that led to violence and then segregation and separatism. And I think that's one of the issues that we have to tackle when we're using the term Cypriot. Because even today in the 21st century, it's at times controversial to declare yourself a Cypriot. It's sometimes taboo to use that term in isolation without any hyphenation. And I think that's really interesting. I think that's really important. I think that says something about the weight of the term Cypriot, the power of the term Cypriot in the 21st century, where we can use it to push pressure against partition, both geographically and the ideology of partition. I mean, to echo some of the theorists that Baria was introducing, Benedict Anderson is another person, for those of you who are familiar with his work, and those of you who don't. He wrote a text called Imagine Communities, which I heartily recommend to anyone who's interested in studying nationhood, and then the overspill into nationalism. And his whole theory is that, you know, national spaces are imagined communities. We create them in our minds. We use things like literature and other bits of cultural production to turn these imaginings into lived experiences. And at times those imaginings have power. They have the ability to topple imperial rule. They have the ability to force people to hold hands, as I think we all kind of hope is the case, if that's not a little bit too idealistic with the future for Cyprus. But other times, as imagined communities need to be reshaped to avoid the overspill into divisive violence and sectarianism. And so for that reason, I'm really interested in thinking about what we can do with the word Cypriot, how we can reclaim it, how we can take that word away from colonizers, from extreme nationalists, and what we can do with it in the year 2021 and beyond. And with that, I pass on to Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been wrestling with, and I think like most of us, my whole life. I definitely see the Cypriot identity as being a plural signifier. I never use the prefixes of being Greek speaking, or Greek Cypriot, or even Greek. You know, I mean, growing up, there was a lot of confusion in the ways in which particularly British Cypriots had to use Greek as a shorthand to explain that they were actually from Cyprus. And then people say, oh, what part of Athens are you from? I'm not from Athens, I'm from Cyprus. Oh, but you're Greek. Yeah, so your family from Greece. No, they're from, and you end up just going round and round and round. And it becomes quite exhausting. I did it today. I had to do it with a guy on the phone. So I think for me, the idea of the British Cypriot, the British means that I'm, as an individual, I can claim both. And it's empowering. Somebody once said to me, like, why don't you just say you're Cypriot? Why don't you say you're British? Why British Cypriot? It's because I'm wrestling with two consciousnesses, like it's a double consciousness, to use Webb Du Bois's term. And I kind of feel that when you're born in the diaspora, you're wrestling with this notion of being British, but that, how do you perform Cypriotness within a British space? And I think that's what's interesting, because then an image of you is projected onto you that usually is Hellenic or Turkish. And so someone's given you an image of what it means to be a Cypriot that has been rendered through the lens of Greco-Turkic culture, but that's not your culture. And I think that it gets really kind of catatonic when you try to distinguish between all these different things. And then you get into language, and you get into religion, and then you get into all these, you know, Maronites, for example, who are kind of Catholic, but have Hellenic surnames, you know, and this is when it also, an extra layer of complexity gets added. So I think that for me, I see that Cypriotness as a plurality, and as Badia was saying, that it was always a mode of empowering Cypriot people. But the problem is nationalists don't like the idea of a Cypriot, because it means that you have to accept everyone, whereas a nationalist would just say we're Greek or we're Turkish, which is much easier to compartmentalize than having to deal with something that doesn't actually have a start or a beginning. In Daniele's book, he talks a lot about the fact that Cyprus has never been pre-colonial. How do you think about a group of people that have never been autonomous? They've never had the ability to self-determine. I mean, they had it for 14 years, but out of those 14 years, only 2 of those years were peaceful. And then by 1963, it started kicking off again. And even now, you've got British bases in Cyprus, and you've got guarantors and all the rest of it. So this is why I kind of feel that these discussions, that just to claim your Cypriot is not as black and white as what a lot of people assume it to be. Elira, you're on mute.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of the responses, and there are some great responses in the chat as well. I think growing up in Cyprus, I didn't really think about it. I was just told what to identify with. But definitely being in England and also never fitting the Greek mold of the Greek-speaking Cypriot identity, I always questioned why I had to be this Hellenistic conscription of myself. And it's what led me to read your works and do the dissertation that I'm doing. And I think it's a question that affects locals and the diaspora equally, this rejection of the motherlands, because at the end of the day, Cyprus is the only motherland a lot of us know, especially those of us who live in Cyprus.
Absolutely. Before I move on to the next question, Anthony, did you have anything else you wanted to ask to any of our panelists related to this topic?
I guess what I'm really interested in, and it's something that has been, maybe this is something that we could unpack a little bit, is the distinction between colonizer and settler. And it's something that I think about a lot, you know, like we talk about the Etio-Cypriots, we talk about the Mycenaeans, and I've used the term that in the early days of Cyprus being populated, these were settlers, but they were also colonizers, because it wasn't terra nullius. There was people there prior to the Mycenaeans turning up. So I guess what I'm interested in is how do we semantically kind of traverse these ideas of, or distinctions between a colonizer, which we assume to be violent and physical and militarized, versus a different form of colonialism, which is cultural, religious, cultural hegemony that would kind of come through settler occupation. Daniele, do you want to talk, and then Badia maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. I think a lot of us here are really concerned with the impact of imperialism on the history of the island and how we define colonialism and coloniality. And as you were saying before, Anthony, I mean, Cyprus throughout its history has been colonized by successive empires, one after the other, leading to my kind of question about whether Cyprus has ever had a pre-colonial moment of its history when the colonization of the island goes back to ancient times. And I think about the word pre-colonial because it's interesting from a post-colonial perspective, insofar as across the world, when there are territories seeking independence from the British Empire or the French Empire, other European powers, there was an attempt to use pre-colonial history and culture as the tools through which to resist imperial rule. And so, you know, what happened in the Cypriot context, where there wasn't this clearly defined moment of history prior to any era of colonization. I think what's interesting and something I talk about in my research is the way in which, as an anti-colonial tactic, and by which I mean an anti-British colonial tactic, a lot of Cypriots use the history of the Byzantine Empire or the Ottoman Empire as the tools through which to define their identity. But I'm always wondering the extent to which those kinds of tools inevitably hark back to a desire to recreate a kind of imperial framework. It's just an imperialism that's centered around a different imperial body, rather, you know, the Byzantine imperial body or the Ottoman imperial body, rather than the British equivalent. Like you, Anthony, I'm really interested in the earliest years of Cypriot history, and that's something that's not talked about. What was happening on the island prior to the arrival of Mycenaeans, for instance, and that's something that's not taught in schools often. It's something that's not encouraged. There's a kind of taboo that goes into talk about that. So I'm interested in kind of the civilizations that were creating places like Hirokitia, which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's really interesting that it's got that international acclaim, and there are many Cypriots who are interested in tapping into that UNESCO label, but without really thinking about who the people were living in Hirokitia. And these were people who, you know, came from the Levantine mainland thousands and thousands of years before Mycenaeans, thousands and thousands of years before Byzantines and Ottomans. And I think we really have to grapple with this history in a critical and faithful way, rather than cherry picking the parts that are useful for a 21st century narrative. From that, I pass on to Baria.
Hi, yeah, I think a really good question, Anthony. I think first of all, in terms of what Dan was saying regarding the pre-colonial encounter and thinking of that pre-colonial moment, it's really interesting that in the literatures, just like you said, Dan, as well, especially the nationalist literatures on both sides of the divide, it's very much that pre-colonial moment, just like many nationalist or nativistic narratives from other post-colonial formerly colonized sites. Pre-colonial moments, say for the Cypriot Turkish writers, the pre-colonial moment meant that moment when it was before the British, the Ottoman moment is pre-colonial. And then for the Cypriot Greeks, it was prior to the Ottoman. The pre-colonial moment was just before the Ottoman. Very much, I'm thinking in terms of the literatures in particular and what the pre-colonial meant and how it operates within the literatures. In terms of Anthony's question, I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure, Dan, you've probably noticed this as well. The case of Cyprus is so distinct, so unique compared to other formerly colonized sites, that it gives way to show that the post-colonial as a discourse is not sufficient to carry the weight of Cyprus. And what I mean by this is, for example, post-colonial discourse as a move predominantly focuses on the 19th century and European imperialism. But Cyprus says, actually, we need to look at a comparative imperialism in order to understand the case of Cyprus or the case of the Mediterranean, where we're looking at the Ottoman moment and the British moment in comparative. A post-colonial discourse, back to your question, Anthony, they categorize settler colonialism and the settler colony in terms of distinguishing two types of European colony. So settler colonies or settler invader ideas, and the colonies of occupation. So Nigeria and India are examples of colonies of occupation, where the indigenous people remained as the majority, but were administered by foreign power. And examples of settler colony would be where over time the invading Europeans annihilated and displaced and marginalized the indigenous people, as in the case of Australia, Canada, and United States. So in post-colonial discourse, this is the way that the settler colonies are addressed. But of course, the case of Cyprus says to us that we need to reassess this definition, this conceptual idea, to rethink it. I don't have an answer right now in terms of how. I think it would definitely be room for a whole new study. And another, a more recent idea of settler colonialism, of course, is the case of Palestine, Israel, where there is the notion of partition. So there's definitely room for us to really think about and think further about this question about settler colonialism and the invader.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you all. And now for our next question, this will be kicked off first by Elida. Thinking about the position from which we each speak, how do you feel your experiences living, in Elida's case, growing up in Cyprus, but then also studying overseas, how your experiences living outside and or inside of Cyprus have shaped the way that you think about identity? And please, I encourage you all to answer this in the chat as well.
Hi, I was born and have lived all my life in Lefkosia or Lefkosia, so I'm literally always 15 minutes from the border. I hear the azan every morning and every night, as well as my own church bells, and have had many friends having to come find me by crossing the border or me crossing the border to them. And it really reminds me that I don't think I've ever had a life that hasn't been political, because even the choice to drink coffee in Lidra Street is a political choice. Having friends who are from the other side is a political choice because it's not always accepted. And I think it is important for all Cypriots to tackle what it means to be political beings, as well as having their own personal emotions and their own personal lives. And what environment we've created, because as Greek-speaking Cypriots, our need to Hellenize ourselves and Hellenize our culture has created, which as Daniela and Bahriye have stated, is a neo-colonial stance, has created a huge alienation, both within our community for those of us who do not live up to the Hellenic Cypriot ideal, which we may not all admit, but we've all felt at some point in our lives, and to the Turkish-speaking Cypriots who've been excluded from the definition of Cypriot, who are under economic subjugation, living in embargoes, and to the Maronite Cypriots whose own language, Sana, is not taught because it doesn't fit into the Hellenic ideal of the South, and even the Armenian Cypriots, who we've also othered within our own community. And we're not only othering ourselves and doing ourselves a disservice, but we're othering every member of our community. And I really hope that this new generation of Greek-speaking Cypriots can really come to grips with what Hellenism has done to us individually and how we tackle colorism and how we tackle our own identity in the self-hatred we grow up with by not being Hellenic enough, but also the communities around us that we have affected. I need to pass my question on. So I'd like to pass that question on to Bahriye.
Thank you, Ilera. I think I completely agree with you with the politics. So wherever you are, in fact, there is the politics that you're confronted with every time you're thinking about the position from which you speak. So like all Cypriots, I think, as I said earlier, in terms of having and speaking from multiple positions between multiple geographies, that has been my experience. I have both lived inside Cyprus for many years and outside where I was born in London, as well as I traveled for many years as well and went off backpacking. And what I have realized through my experience of being in this in-between space, I think that one of the most important things that I have learned, and I think in my book as well, because through writing, through reading, is that creating a binary between the Cypriots who remained and the Cypriots, so the people of Cyprus who remained in the island and the people of Cyprus who left the island as a result, of course, of the post-colonial moment and the failures and coming to the former imperial center. But creating a binary between these two groups is very, very problematic. And I see this as problematic because these two groups of people have common ground. They have shared experiences where together they have been displaced in various ways, in one way or another. Together they long without belonging. And it is through crossing the bridge between the Cypriots who remained and the Cypriots who departed that we can blur the binaries, the various binaries that figure in Cyprus, in order to capture and negotiate with a new kind of doubling. Just like Anthony said earlier about a double consciousness that Dubois talks about, there's also a doubling that Homi Bhabha, a great theorist, talks about. But it's a new kind of doubling and a new kind of tripling that fits the case of Cyprus. It's an alternative, one that stands between binaries like, okay, Cypriot Greek, Cypriot Turk, North and South, yes, but move beyond that to third positions. And what does it mean? What does it mean to have a new kind of doubling? So yes, there is the British and the Cypriot doubling, but there's also a Cypriot Greek and Cypriot Turkish kind of doubling, but there's also what I've noticed in all of the literatures, which is really, really interesting. Many of the writers of the diaspora who'd left the island ended up having doubles in the island in order to be able to kind of see the connections within the island. So for example, renowned writer Stefanos Stephanidis, excellent writer, his double was Niki Marangor, renowned novelist and poet, but at the same time he had another double who remained in Cyprus, the renowned fantastic poet Gurgenç. And then here you see a kind of tripling that's operating within our understanding of identity. And I want to point out here at the power of literature in capturing this dynamics between the shifting positions and the ways in which place and space and displacement is so central within the literatures that I've come to kind of see a diasporic experience with those who remained as well as those who departed. And I just want to end on this note because I think it's really important, drawing on the Cypriot Maronite poet, Napoleon Terzi, who says, and I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about our positioning. He says in his poem, in a roundabout way, I'm not going to just cite the poem, but I'll just say that we are wanderers who hang around, us Cypriots are wanderers that hang around aimlessly in homes and positions that belong to others. Living without a single concrete home and identity, we shift between birth country and adopted country and global geographies beyond. And it's in this way that we can capture the true being and becoming of Cypriot and that differential transnational Mediterranean island of Cyprus, which we truly are. Thank you. And I'll hand you over to Anthony.
Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah, thank you. I agree that was really beautifully put together. I'm reading through the comments as well, some really interesting stuff going on. I think it's this idea that we all come back to, and it's what everyone is having to reckon with in their own way, of what it means to be a Cypriot. And I kind of feel that Cyprus has always been in this kind of liminal space, right? And I know Daniele and Badia both talk about it in their work. It's this idea that it's always been transitional, like it's never been fixed, like people have always been using it to pass through. So the idea that we're products of a bifurcation, like we're products of splitting, is prevalent in the fact that here we are 2,500 years later, having the very same discussion around who we are. There's not many nationalities that have this very specific discussion because of our history that is quite unique to the way in which Cyprus has been constructed over the years. My main thing, back to the question, is this idea of erasure. So when you tell people, and this is me being slightly dogmatic, but it's fine, when you tell people that you are Greek, for instance, and you kind of use that as a shorthand, because a lot of British English people or Americans, they don't really understand that Cyprus is its own thing, and you can't be bothered to do the labor work, to have to go through and explain the history and the colonialism and the Byzantines and the Phoenicians and the Persians and the Arabs and the Egyptians. So you literally just say, yeah, I'm Greek. That is really dangerous, in my opinion. Like, that is something that, because what you're doing is you are erasing yourself. It's the idea of sticking to your guns and saying, I'm a Cypriot, you don't know, I'm going to tell you what that means. And I've been in really awkward, difficult situations where I refuse the nationalist signifiers of Greek and Turk, and I just say, I'm a Greek-speaking Cypriot who was born in the UK, and this is what it means. Because by doing that, you acknowledge your ancestors, you acknowledge the experience, you acknowledge your lineage. Greece and Turkey do not have the histories of Cyprus. So by affiliating yourself with Greece and Turkey, you completely disregard 2,000 years of Cypriot history. And so I feel, for me, it's really important that is contained within the argument that you are a Cypriot. And we also have to accept that this is culturally and geographically specific. In other words, the idea of a Cypriot shifts. I've met Cypriots in Australia who have a very different experience to Cypriots in New York, to Cypriots in London, and to Cypriots in London. So wherever, and in Cyprus, I mean, so wherever you are, that it was always going to shift. So again, we have to resist essentialism that kind of reduces the Cypriot experience down to one thing, which it doesn't. And we have to be open and broad and plural in the way in which we think about the kind of the multivalent elements that are contained within the Cypriot identity. Daniele.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I agree with you entirely. I like that sense of erasure. I think that's really important about removing elements that seem kind of undesirable or too difficult to grapple with. And part of the question is, well, undesirable for who? Too difficult to deal with for who? Particularly when it comes to attempting to express your identity in the United Kingdom. If we're thinking about the former imperial metropolis, what it means to have to use those codes that we inherit from years of British imperialism that introduced the lexis of race and ethnicity across the world, that kind of coding that's then been transplanted everywhere and is then internalized. I think that kind of internalizing of the violence of colonialism and nationalism is something that's really important to think about. And I think another term that we could use in addition to erasure is translation. These kind of overly simplistic translations of our identity to appease other people, and what it means to kind of take something and remove so much of it through these simplistic translations that don't do justice to the core material. The idea that we lose in translation as well as gain in translation. I suppose going back to the original question, I'm really interested in all of these kind of false dichotomies that Cypriots have to contend with continually, and how they play out in these false dichotomies of inside and outside. This suggestion that the experience of Cypriots in Cyprus and the experience of Cypriots in the United Kingdom, for instance, and other diasporic communities across the world, that is a relationship of inside and outside. We forget, for instance, that the British Cypriot community, the American Cypriot community, South African Cypriot community, these communities exist out of necessity. This is, they were created because of the displacement, the forced displacement and dispossession of people who became refugees. And so we have to break down that dichotomy and open up the communication between the island of Cyprus and the various diasporas across the world. In addition to that, when we're thinking of inside and outside, I'm always interested in unpacking where inside and outside begins. There are some Cypriots who view their identity as one with Greece, and therefore they see themselves inside the Hellenic Republic. Equally, there are Cypriots who speak Turkish who see themselves as being inside the Republic of Turkey. And so where does inside and outside begin in terms of the island of Cyprus and Greece and Turkey? How do we bridge moments of connection, collaboration? How do we also kind of recalibrate those dichotomies of inside and outside. Another similar kind of inside and outside that I'm interested in is that of continents too. Continually interested in the way in which Cyprus has this confused position between different continents. Obviously, as you know, everyone here knows, it's in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's between Europe, Asia, and Africa. But there's always this very Eurocentric push to be part of Europe, to whitewash the history of the island. Again, it's another area of taboo within Cyprus, where it's considered a bad thing to recognize that maybe Cyprus might be geographically in Asia if these continents have any kind of relevance to identities in the first place. And so that kind of that liminality, that interstitiality between continents is always so fascinating to me, and how we kind of have to push beyond these Eurocentric ways of defining race and ethnicity, continental affiliation, national affiliation, and really we should just break down these false dichotomies and explore something that's a lot more kind of faithful to the multiplicity of the Cypriot experience. And pass on to Elira.
I think just because we only have 14 minutes left in Q&A, we will let Elida field this question along with the next one I'm going to answer. I think this will have to probably be our last question, unless we keep it brief. And this is going to get handed to you, Daniele. So let's talk about the role that poetry and literature play in the evolution of the Cypriot identity. How has the legacy of empire and colonialism shaped Cypriot poetry and literature of the past and present? This is a multi-part question. So also that's looking back and present, but then looking forward, what societal factors stand to most prominently influence future Cypriot poetry and literature? And we can start receiving questions in the Q&A if you all would like, and we'll kind of review them and once it becomes that time.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of central to my work and my research, thinking about the relationship between imperialism and literature. I think there's a huge indelible relationship between the two. So many theorists, including Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak, are a couple of individuals who talk about the way in which the 19th century English novel, English language, British novel cannot exist without British imperialism, and the novel form was a product of imperialism. And so the way in which those genres have been inherited over the centuries kind of tells us something about this, as I say, indelible relationship between literature and imperialism. I think with kind of imperialism on the island, there was a time before the 50s and 60s where no kind of written literature about Cyprus was produced by people who identified as Cypriots. And so there was a great kind of outpouring of text by British writers in particular. And I'm thinking of names like Lawrence Durrell, for instance, and his Bitter Lemons, that were using their texts as a way to code and codify the island and its inhabitants. And British literary representations of the island became a tool of imperialism in many ways. There are these huge intersections between politics and literature as I'm kind of gesturing towards. And so in response to that, Cypriot writers in the 60s onwards are then taking those literary forms and genres, grappling with them, rewriting them, reclaiming them in order to express their personal agency through forms of literature that respond to the issues of the texts that have come before. So I mean, it's really difficult to kind of narrow that down into kind of simplistic ways within the time limit. But I think, you know, the future with Cypriot literature needs to be aware of this weight, needs to be aware of the weight of colonialism, the weight of nationalism that's come afterwards, and needs to think about the ways in which literature can reform itself and transform itself into the next century. With that, I pass on to Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm not coming at it from a particularly academic space. I come at it more as a poet and as a thinker. And for me, I think that as far as literature is concerned, it does a huge job, particularly in Bitter Lemons, in how it shapes public thought and how it shapes the imagination. You know, Claudia Rankine, writers such as this have written excessively about the ways in which literature can shift people's opinion. I mean, we see it with Brexit, and we saw it all over here, the idea of media literacy, the fact that so many people don't practice media literacy, that they read the tabloids and they take it as truth. And I think, like as Daniela was saying, the novel, particularly 20th century novels, had the same kind of hold on the way that the other was shaped. And if you read some of those writings from the, from 1878 onwards, it's very clear that the Orientalists saw Cypriots as hybrids, as in-betweeners. They didn't know who we were. They didn't know how to treat us. They didn't know, these guys are in the UN still have Cyprus as Western Asia. So the fact that you're in this geographic space, yet you're not quite Greek, you're not quite Turkish, who are you guys, has always been reflected in the literatures that I've read anyway, and that have come out of it. And I think there's been certain writers, I'm one of those writers, who who's grappling with those ambiguities. There's so much uncertainty that exists within the Cypriot identity, both on the island and in the diasporic community as well. And I think to make art out of that without being didactic, without being absolutist, and to try and find the kind of the balance within those ideas has been what I've based most of my writing on and most of my thinking. And having these discussions with other artists, theatre makers, activists, academics, dancers, has been really, for me, very generative in how you kind of think about it. And it's also about writing back, right? It's this idea that you write back, that you talk back to the imperialists, you talk back to the Orientalists. And now that we have a voice, we have a platform, there are people who are interested and who are listening to this, and that they understand it goes beyond being Greek and beyond being Turkish. And so it's brought people into that conversation. So I think now is a very kind of a fecund time to be writing about what it means to be a Cypriot. Elira.
I mean, this topic is really close to my heart because it's what my dissertation is about. To just jump off, since I'm writing on Anthony anyway, there's a brilliant section in one of his poems, After the Formalities, where the speaker looks in the mirror, and as he's looking in the mirror, he notices his hooked nose because he's just been in a fight and the nose is kind of broken. And he thinks, oh, the English, their nose doesn't hook like ours. And I was struck when I read it because it was an experience minus the beating up that I'd had. And I think many Greek-speaking Cypriots have, when they look in the mirror and they think, well, how come I don't look Greek if that's who I am? And it's such a fundamental moment of Cypriotness that I've never seen on page. And linking to someone like Taner Beybars, who is a Turkish-speaking Cypriot from the 70s, he also has this mirror in his poem where he looks at it and he wonders what his Cypriotness really means and how it can be translated now that he's left Cyprus. And to see both a Greek-speaking Cypriot and a Turkish-speaking Cypriot approach the mirror in such a similar way, and in a way that I found so moving in my own personal life, really made me realize that why aren't we all reading Anaxagorou and Beybars at school? And why, instead of Gavati, and why aren't we seeing our own experiences reflected in our art, because it's what we deserve? And passing it on to Bahriya.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to step in here. Bahriya, please answer this question, but also the final question we were going to have you kick off answering, if you want to cover that as well, is what is the role of the emerging generation of Cypriots to help shape the narratives of our collective Cypriot identity? How can those listening in, many of whom are writers and artists in their own right, make their vital contribution? So feel free to answer in any and all ways, both questions.
But I think I'll just answer a little bit in terms of the literature in relation to Cypriot identity, and it links to empire and colonialism, because that has been a central part of my research and the book and my 10 years of work. So I'm going to try and succinctly and simply kind of explain, and drawing on what's already been said. I think obviously literature and the literatures of Cyprus has been central to the understanding and the formation of identity and engaging with the colonial encounter. So the operation of the name games that I discussed in the opening figures in the literatures, where there's constant debate about it. Our literatures are not Cypriot literatures, they're Turkish literatures, or they're Greek literatures, or Turkish Cypriot literatures. And this is reflected both in terms of publishing, where for many years, the people of Cyprus would try and publish in the alternative centers, but predominantly, and I'm really interested in what Ilera said, education. The education of the literatures turns to the alternative Turkey or Greece and uses those curriculums. And 70% or 80% of what students are studying are the curriculums of Greece or Turkey, and a very small amount is Cypriots. By that I mean Cypriot, Greek, Turkish, Armenian, or Maronite literatures. And what we see is, though, there is a Cypriot consciousness, and that Cypriot consciousness, all of these Cypriot narratives are responding to the colonial moment, are responding to the anti-colonial moment, are responding to the partition moment in relation to place and space. So these two literatures, Cypriot Greek, Cypriot Turk, across the divide, common ground, completely following a same kind of engagement with spatiality that is so core, spatiality that figures. You've got the nationalists on both sides of the divide, whether that be Özker Yashin, Süleyman Uluçemgil, and then on the other side, Özker Yashin, Claire Angelides, and the list goes on. You've got zines, magazines, and both sides are doing very similar things. Then when we think about the Cypriotist communists, starting from as early as 1900s, again, so much common ground between the ways in which they're negotiating with writing, mapping Cyprus in response to the colonial encounter. Sadly, however, what I argue is that the people of Cyprus and our literatures of Cyprus, we are stuck in the decolonial moment. And what that means is that because of that fear of de-ethnicization, because of the moment of Cypriotization and the policies that came about from the British rule, neither side is fully engaging with the literatures by Cypriots, and they're both looking to the alternative centers, if you want to call it that. And this has given way for the literatures to suffer, for the literatures to be in the margins and underground, where the people of Cyprus themselves won't be able to tell you too much about the literatures by Cypriots. And I've got a thorough study of the education from the Ottoman moment all the way to today that captures that. In terms of the kinds of literatures that are emerging today, what I find really, really interesting is that my definitions of the literature of Cyprus is that it's a transnational world literature wherein all texts are post-colonial diasporic writings between the cultural and political history of colonization, partition, and conflicting identities. Today's emerging writers, both in the UK and in Cyprus, are looking at this marginalization, but from a completely different perspective. It's no longer about these binaries, Turks and Greeks. Yes, it is very much about a fragmented unity in terms of Cypriotness with its multiplicity and the transnational approach, but they're looking at new ideas. LGBTQ+, for example, is so core in our literatures. I'm working on a new project, and I sent out a call. In 2 days, I have got 90 amazing entries, and I'm working with an amazing group of people. Women, notion of women is so core right now. There's a new interest in Cypriot girls who were sold to the Arabs in the 1920s, including my great auntie. Lots of literature around this. Refugees in Cyprus, Syrians and Palestinians in Cyprus. A new amazing group of women, Collective Arianna, currently working on East Mediterranean and womanhood. There's a forthcoming excellent event. Another emerging group of migrant workers that are looking at the Indonesian and Filipino migrant workers and engaging with literature. So we're really moving beyond this fixity of Greekness and Turkishness. And yeah, I think you wanted us to, I guess I've kind of answered the question in terms of the emerging generation, but I think I'll end by just making the point that I think we have the responsibility as all of us are kind of emerging generations, the responsibility to know our heritage and history and embrace the generations that came before us. So the nationalist generations and the literary contributions that they made, respect and hats off to them. Those zines, the anti-colonial moment, whether it's EOKA or TMT, there is a literary aesthetics there that we must respect. The Cypriotist moment from 1960s to 1970s and the peace poets that came about, the Camden Festival Collective, the diaspora of the 1980s, these people, the Aida Mehmed Ali, Alev Adi, Zeki Ali, Haji Mike, Eli Filippo, Fikret Demira, Moleskis, the list goes on. They set the foundation, and my argument is we have a responsibility to acknowledge them. Then we have a responsibility, I think, to be in dialogue with the literatures and arts in Cyprus that's happening right now, some amazing works happening right now. For example, there's an exhibition, a forthcoming exhibition called Seeking Roots that engages with identity and space and place that will be at NEMAC. It's amazing, looking at the rhizomatic play of identity. And I think we also have a responsibility to look at these literatures in the UK and in Cyprus, and from the localized, thinking of our own marginalized experiences, our experiences of displacement, and linking that to global encounters so that we can write together, create together towards a distinct solidarity, a distinct Cypriot solidarity that captures the truth of space for a differential Mediterranean and a world. Thank you so much. And I'll now hand you over to Dan to speak about this question.
I think we might want to open it up to Q&A, but if you have anything you want to succinctly say, Daniele, that'd be great. And then I'll open it up.
I guess just 30 seconds just to say, yeah, I really agree with you, Badia, there. I think really important point. That word responsibility is crucial. I think we have to take personal responsibility in terms of the way in which we're taking everything that's happened over the past 100 years plus and working with that material critically, really thinking critically about the ideas that we inherit and that we receive. Just looking at the chat really quickly, it's interesting to see so many references to Greek school in the UK, and maybe we could extend that to Turkish schools in the UK as well. Baria and Ilaira are mentioning this relationship between pedagogy, i.e. education, and its relationship with identity politics and cultural, the production of culture. It's so important to think critically about what these pedagogical centers are doing and the responsibility that they have, over others. I think spaces like Greek schools and Turkish schools in the UK are vital when members of the Cypriot diaspora are on the receiving end of racism and xenophobia, when there's a desperate need to maintain contact with languages of Cyprus, but equally, in addition to those spaces, and make sure those spaces are as inclusive as possible, making sure those spaces, aren't spaces that are fueling xenophobic ideas in and of themselves. In addition to those spaces, we need collaborative spaces as well. We need spaces in London and the rest of the UK and elsewhere in the diaspora that bring Turkish-speaking Cypriots, Greek-speaking Cypriots, Armenian-speaking Cypriots, Arabic-speaking Cypriots together in the same space to share their experiences, to share their literature, to share their voices, to understand the points of commonality. If we live in the Cypriot diaspora, but we choose to cut ourselves off by only speaking to Cypriots who speak the same language as us, then we're culpable of the same kind of partition tactics that are happening on the island itself. And we can't let the diaspora become partitioned as well. We have to make the diaspora as inclusive, as multicultural as possible. And I think Badia is right on the money when she says that comes from personal responsibility. We need to take responsibility for the spaces in which we find ourselves, the centers in which we find ourselves, and the diasporic facilities that we use. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. This first one we received, it's kind of open-ended. I'll see where you all take it, and I'll toss it to Anthony first. So this is from, and apologies if I butcher anyone's name, Daria Tashli. I am genetically a hybrid, but identify as Turkish Cypriot. I am enjoying the literary work and poetry that are shared on social media lately that I follow. I also feel it in my guts, the emotions portrayed and the depictions told. I want to free Cyprus and Cypriots from any pain and suffering. How should we do that? So if you have an answer, Anthony, that'd be great.
I mean, I don't have an answer. I share the sentiment. I think tolerance is really important, but I think what's more important than tolerance is having a robust understanding of who we are. And that means having to let go and resist nationalism, jingoism, all the things that politicians use to keep people divided from each other. I think for me, I found a lot of solace in actually studying genetics, because when you study when genetically you study Cypriots, we're the same people. And when you forget all this Greek, Turkish, Maronite, we're the same people. Under a microscope, we're exactly the same. In fact, there's a study that we're going to put a link to, but what it found is that Cypriots, Turkish-speaking Cypriots and Greek-speaking Cypriots have the closest genetic link than any other region in the Levant. So we are literally the same people. Whereas if you go to other countries, you can distinguish between the two. But geneticists couldn't do that with Cyprus because they were the same groups of people. And so I think having that understanding, and all week long, I get Cypriots emailing me, sending me stuff on Instagram. I just had a DNA test. And guess what? I'm 2% Greek and I'm 48% Palestinian and I'm 27% Jordanian. And I'm just like, did you really think that you came from Athens? Like, look at you. You really think that you came from Thessaloniki? Like, you're nuts. Like, this is what's crazy is you look in the mirror, you see how we look, how we present. And it's very clear that we don't come from mainland Greece. Like, it's clear that we're a mixture, but for some reason we need to have a DNA test to prove this to ourselves. And this is what I find completely bonkers, is that it's there. Like, you know, it's all just in us. And accepting that and embracing it and celebrating that pluralism, that hybridity, is what will literally push us through, and the generation that comes after us, into social cohesion. And that's really what the mission is about.
Great, thank you. I think we could keep each of these answers to 1 or 2 people. So if anyone else, just speak up. If the second person wants to answer this question, then I'm going to move on to the next, so we can try to get as many out as possible.
I think that's a really, really good question. And I would say, rather than choosing to free ourselves from the pain and suffering, I would say embrace the pain and suffering, but embrace the pain and suffering from the other side, if you like. So in terms of thinking of the suffering of your grandmother, yeah, so my grandmother Badia, but then when I looked at the literatures of Claire Angelides, she had, who's the same age as my mother, who has been displaced and uprooted, I could see common experiences of pain and displacement. And that to me is the definition of Cypriot solidarity. Together we are in pain, together we are displaced, together we are suffering, and only together we can heal, would be my answer to that question. So thank you. I think it's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm going to share a couple of questions I think have some relation together. So one from Carrie Kyriakos Michael asked, why are we not talking about our place in the Middle East? Is that the British Empire hold on us or something else? And Anna Gavala asked how the panelists situate themselves in terms of a MENA or Swana or Levantine identity as opposed to white or other. So maybe let's start with those two kind of combined. And I'll pass it to Daniele to take first.
Arianna. Yeah, I think they're fascinating questions. I think they have points of connection to something I kind of mentioned earlier about Cyprus being between different continents, and how we think about that, how we grapple with that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of internalized racism that goes into that. You know, it's if we think about the field of Orientalism, this sort of British and French construction of the Middle East that was disseminated across the world, that suggested the Middle East was a bad place. And through one of these false dichotomies, Europe was created as a place of civilization and democracy. And so when Cyprus gained independence in 1960, it's a push towards being, or rather becoming, European as a way of living through that internalized racism. And I think it's now that we have to tackle that, and we have to recognize that Cyprus is geographically in Asia. It's geographically in this part of the world that we might call the Middle East, and that's not a bad thing. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. It's years of colonial rule that has told us that being Middle Eastern is a bad thing, and now we have to reclaim that agency and realize that being part of the Middle East it has no value judgment at all. It's simply a part of Cyprus's geography, it's part of Cyprus's history, and therefore we need to think about ways in which a Levantine identity can be a mode of resistance against the kind of Eurocentric violence that Cyprus has faced after years of European rule. I think with that I pass to Baria.
Yeah, I think excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that question. I'm actually, so right now I'm working on, my new book is on the post-colonial East Mediterranean, and I'm particularly interested in looking at that. So it's about my argument, and I'm very much using the concept of Cyprus as the balcony of the Mediterranean Sea, drawing on the ancient Greek idea of Cyprus and the balconies of the Greek islands that are all interconnected with the great Greek motherland. But of course, thinking of this within a post-colonial idea of Cyprus being a balcony of the Mediterranean Sea that looks to the East Mediterranean, and the crossovers looking at post-Ottoman, post-British relations. And I think there's quite a lot of common ground. And the interesting thing with Cyprus, where I'm using this notion of the balcony, is that, like Dan said, it's a strategic location, right? It's neither inside nor outside of what's going on, but it's at a vantage point that can capture an alternative way of thinking of the East Mediterranean and redefining the East Mediterranean, where we can, I feel that it's the displaced people that give way for us to understand the region and redefine the region. So I think, and there's a lot of projects as well going on in terms of the East Mediterranean, and people from Palestine, Syria, and Cypriots working together actively right now in Cyprus for various projects, including me being a part of Collective Arianna, which is a group of East Mediterranean women who are directly engaging with these ideas. So yeah, thanks. I'll pass you over to Anthony.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. I want to just pick up on something because I think those two questions were answers were great. I want to pick up on something that I saw, the idea of how do we respond as people of, are we people of color? Are we white? What are we? And I can't tell you the amount of times I get asked this question, like throughout the week from Cypriots, both in Cyprus and in the diaspora, like emails saying, am I white? Can you please explain? Because I don't feel white. But then when I tell people that I'm Cypriot, they kind of say, yeah, but you're Greek, so you're definitely white. And you're like, yeah, but I'm not Greek, I'm Cypriot. So what am I? And I can't tell people how to identify that. That's not within my jurisdiction. But what I can do is think about race and the taxonomies and the constructs of race as one, as a social group, whiteness as a social group, as a kind of block, but also whiteness as power. And I'm going to use Baldwin's analogy that whiteness is power. And in the grand scheme of things, where you look where Cyprus actually is situated, we can straddle 3-4 different boxes. And personally, I do not identify as white. I do not see Cypriots as white. Do I see Greeks as white? Yes, I do. Do I see Italians and Spanish and Portuguese? Yes, I do. Do I see Cypriots? I do not. And the reason is because of the history and the hybridity of a group of people. And whiteness usually comes out of the idea that you are Greek or you're Turkish. Turkish speaking Cypriots have the same issue. You know, I have emails from Turkish speaking Cypriots that aren't too clear whether they are white or whether they're Muslim, or has Islam become racialized? So does that mean that I'm not post 9/11? So, you know, People in Lebanon identify as white. People in Syria identify as white. In fact, 75.6% of Puerto Ricans within Puerto Rico identify as white. The problem is that when you take away these boxes and you don't give people the options, you're going to be ticking white because there's nothing else there. If you just have the box black, Asian, white, and other, I've always ticked other. But if you don't want to tick other, you end up just, well, I'm not black and I'm not Asian, so I must be white. And this is the problem, is that it's a forced process of coercion or assimilation. And this is what they do in the United States, and this is what they do here as well. So to refuse those categories and to have other, it makes you feel a little bit kind of, you know, insignificant. But for me, it's true, rather than ticking the white box, which I know that I'm not. And I never have been, because when the colonizers were in Cyprus, they didn't see us as white. And that's documented in the way that we were treated and in the way in which they behaved towards indigenous people. So that's kind of where I sit on it. And I'm not talking on behalf of every Cypriot. And this is a very contentious issue. And it's something that will constantly be in debate, but that's just where I sit on it.
All right, sorry to be a stickler with time, but with 10 minutes to go, and then we'll wrap up with a poetry reading from each of us. I'll start this one with Baria, then you can pass to someone else. This is from Andreas Pavlou, and he asks, can the speakers discuss a little bit about the question of political power and the Cypriot identity? So many people, places of power in society feed the narrative of Greekness, Turkishness. So how can we create the space and power that puts our Cypriotness first? Cypriotness directly challenges that power, which maintains itself using the Greek-Turkish identity for its own personal gain, which makes it so difficult.
Shall I go? My argument in the book and in my lived and literary and artistic experiences is space. I say, as Henry Lefebvre says, space is the most powerful tool. It serves as a tool of thought and action, of domination and power. If we can control space around us, if we can use the tools to read our space, to write our space, but to take back control of our space. And by space, this could be various things, but it's in terms of our country, in terms of our public spaces, to take back control. And that's exactly, with the colonialists, it was about a spatiality. It was about going in and mentally mapping and taking control and imagine geography of that location. And of course, during the anti-colonial moment, the peoples wrote back, and they wrote back through claiming their space. You can claim your space through thinking about the dominant official minds and the ways in which they construct their spaces through maps, through the underground station. They control our spatial practices. And Henry Lefebvre gives us the tools to take back control, to be able to read these mental spaces produced by the official minds, so that we can prioritize the social lived spaces that are controlled by these dominant minds. This is not conspiracy. This is a Marxist socialist approach in terms of how space operates. And I would say that is the political tool to take back control. And Henry Lefebvre calls this a truth of space. The truth of space means exposing the contradictions as produced by those official and dominant minds, so that the marginalized peoples, the public, us people, can take back control of our spaces. Because our identities, our identification is determined and are determined by the spaces and places that we are living in. But we have no control over any of this. Even the flat I'm living in right now, it's in beautiful Canterbury, but it's located in a middle-class elite area. However, this particular flat is an ex-council flat that was produced by Labour for those people who were poorer, but then this flat was later, of course, privatized. So that's what I mean, this kind of operation. And I need to control myself because I can go on and on about this. But I would love to discuss further. I could spend hours just talking about space and going into jargon land. So I'll hand you over to Dan.
Yeah, I think really interesting question and really great ideas there, Barry. I definitely agree. I think in terms of power with Cyprus, again, coming back to where Cyprus and Cypriots position themselves, there's always this kind of suggestion that power lies outside of the island. And I think for the last century, there's been this suggestion that power lies in London, or it lies in Athens, or it lies in Ankara, and there's no sense of Cyprus being a site of power in and of itself. And I think that's something that hopefully we can kind of push towards changing, the suggestion that power can come from within Cypriotness and within Cypriot communities working together. I really like Barry's attention to space, and in similar and different ways, I'd focus on language, for instance, and the concept of dominant discourse, for instance, the forms of language, the forms of speech act that have power and have had power for centuries, a power that's disseminated from London, from Athens, and from Ankara. And what happens when Cypriot individuals create something that we might describe as counter-discursive, that works against that dominant discursive power. And so I think, I kind of look towards the future of Cypriot literature and other kinds of cultural production where Cypriots are using their voices to speak back against those sources of power from across the world that have attempted to co-opt the island for its imperial and neo-colonial agendas. And if we have time with that, I'd pass on to Elira.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I just got lost because there are so many questions and so many thoughts. But I think just jumping on from that, and jumping on from, I'm seeing a lot of debates in the chat room as well. I just want to highlight the importance of having these kinds of conversations, because as Daniela said, this is such a nuanced and complex topic, and there is so many pluralities and so many different interpretations. Like, I'm seeing people who are saying, we look fair, so we benefit from whiteness and that's it. And there's some validity to that. And some other people saying, well, I don't look that white, so I don't benefit from that. And it just goes to show that we need these kinds of debates and discussions amongst ourselves as Cypriots. And I think these are conversations we just haven't been having for years that are finally coming to the surface.
Savannah, how she needs to change her habits.
Someone is not muted. Please mute yourself.
Even if it's just getting outside.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. I'm so conflicted with the questions that we have remaining. So I'm going to try to kind of combine two. And if Anthony, you want to take that and tie a bow on it, feel free.
Now I'm trying to replace those memories.
Your name is Spiros. Please mute yourself. Thank you. So you will get called out if you are not muted. So for Arianna, here's the question: how do we begin to uncover a post-colonial identity when we don't really have a pre-colonial one? I will just truncate it with that. And then Leandros Farley Stamadiavis is speaking from the diaspora perspective and asked, could the panel discuss where there is a subsection of Cypriotness comprises Cypriots of Cyprus and Cypriots of the diaspora? Those are two pretty different questions, but if you'd like to touch on either of those, I just want as many people to feel heard as possible.
I can think about the first one. The second one would probably be for Barrier or Daniele, but the first one is, I mean, it's something that I think about a lot because it involves having to have an apparatus in place that allows you to think about yourself. So for instance, in India, and in the continent of Africa, you have the Mughal Empire, or you have the Mali Empire, or you have the Incas, the Aztecs. You have different groups of people that existed before colonialism, and that kind of gives you a framework to think about yourself. Whereas in Cyprus, we don't have that, which is why we latch on so much to being Greek or Turkish, because there is a framework there. You do have the legacies of the Ottoman Empire and the legacies of the kind of the Greco-Hellenic Empire that you kind of latch onto. And I think it's just easier. It's easier to do, but it's not true. That's the problem, is that it is a form of erasure, like as I said earlier. But I also think for me, what I take comfort in is knowing that I am a mixture of many, many different things. And there's actually very close parallels with Latin America and Cyprus, because of the histories of colonialism within Latin America and the indigenous people that were there before, and how they got coerced into having to adopt names, religions, and all these kinds of things. Some of the best essays I've read on race actually have come from Latin American writers who have been writing about from Venezuela, from Guatemala, from Peru, and it's really interesting to see those parallels between Cyprus and Latin America. So that's what I would say. I'd say to him, you have to kind of rid your mind from this absoluteness, and you have to see yourself as a product of many different things over a large period of time.
Wonderful, thank you. And with that, we have 5 minutes remaining to do our poetry reading each. So Anthony, if you're ready to go, I was just going to have us go in alphabetical order. Otherwise, I'd be happy to kick us off.
Yeah. You go ahead, because I just spoke. So
yeah. I'll let you catch your breath. Okay. So this, and as I mentioned, I'm affiliated with the group, The Peaceful Poetry of Cyprus. Please find us on Instagram, or you can email me at peacefulpoetryofcyprus@gmail.com to submit your own work. So this poem, which I wrote for you all today, is called A Collective Individual Journey. Our journey is collective, and yet we travel alone. Across the wine-dark sea, through the murky woods, atop the treacherous peaks. Our journey is collective, and yet we swim against the current, we illuminate the shadows, we scale the mountaintops, until our view is clear with our own two eyes. No matter what we were told before, no matter who harmed whom, we are a collective immersed in love, and yet we think alone. And whoever would like to go next, whether it's Anthony or Badia, if we're going alphabetically.
So Badia, you want to go?
Okay.
Oh, she's there, yeah.
I'm here. Okay. So this is, it's a really long poem, so I'm just going to read a passage of it. It's called Spatial Tripling, the epic book of Bahar. Cyprus in my 30s, the cauldron took her in. She drank it, tripping, the red-haired woman of the sea. Deniz, Bahar, Thalassa, Kitabi, Bahriye. She saw it from the sea, you see. Name games, number games, competing maps, complex tales, lost in trials. Childhood bedtime stories narrated by my grandmother. Read bedtime stories narrated by your grandmother. She hid in the spaces of forbidden games. Away from the sea, I see it from this balcony of the East Mediterranean Sea, and I won't be away from the sea. Cyprus is in the margins of his poem, The Kurd and the Arab. Like you, all I have is the wind, poisoned by truth. Truth. I am a Zionist. Physical form of your occupation. Her nan, my nan, plants her headless chicken in my our garden. Her mum and dad reconstruct their refugee childhood in my our land. Get my family out. Leave. Returning, turn. Let them use their keys. Throw away your keys. Nene, my grandma, diagnosed my illness as paraphilia, a key fetish, with BPD, borderline partition disorder. And on my wedding night, my nan gave me her free keys from her bridal home. Truth, I am a Palestinian. They sold my great aunt, the most expensive girl in the village. Fanara to Jaffa, Al-Birwa, Haifa to Beirut to Amman. Truth, I'm unfit. You will not write Cyprus, they say. She cannot write Cyprus, they say. It's off the map. She doesn't fit. You bello turco. You will change your name, they say.
Amazing. That was great. Yeah, what we're going to do actually is we're going to put links to all these, all the books. We're going to have a document. I'm probably, Arianna's going to mention it, but we'll have a document and all this stuff will be in there. So yeah, links to everything that we've spoken about, poems and whatnot. I'll read, this is a poem from After the Formalities. It's called Cause. And to the burning I say, my worry is a whole country. I've been myself longer than my undoing. Heavy trunk of silverware, museum glass polish, portraiture of bent flags. I'm here as my grandparents were, only with a moving mouth. During empire, my people were subjects first, citizens later, once the vigilantes managed to zip up their coats. Flames lambent. My grandmother died with umbrellas outstretched in her gut. My grandmother died. To be British is to be everywhere. Some roots have been in the earth for so long, they know only to call themselves earth. A worm's pink nipple bleeds into snow. My birth, my mother's brown skin. I'd already filled half myself with Britannia's air. It took them a month to find my name. And Daniele.
These are tough acts to follow. I can tell you that. Okay, my poem's called Grandfather's Potatoes. Every week you would tell us stories of the potatoes you grew in the nutrient-rich iron red soil, and the taxes imposed on sales by the British, and the fighting and bullet shells on the fields, and how you brought your knowledge over and turned a small North London garden into an impromptu potato farm, cutting off the English roses and creating beds of Cyprus potatoes, each frond listening to the North Circular in the brown dirt between the privet. I've tried planting potatoes since you left, but they never grow the way they did for you. Now they never grow at all, neither on this island or that.
And with that, that concludes our discussion today, but there will be more, and we will be sharing a recording of today's discussion along with a document of many resources that were referenced today and more. So thank you so much for being part of our inaugural Exploring the Cypriot Identity. There are many, many layers, and we will unpack as many as we can, as often as we can, as deeply as we can. But thank you so much. And if you'd like to be in touch with us, you know where to find us, at least through the Peaceful Poetry of Cyprus Gmail account that was connected to the Eventbrite. So please come with your ideas, and thank you so much.